Did you know that there was once a place said to be so perfect that history itself may have erased it? A land beyond the known world, beyond maps, beyond certainty. According to ancient accounts, it existed far to the north, untouched by war, sickness, or time. They called it Hyperborea. But there's a problem. No ruins, no coordinates, no undeniable proof. So was Hyperborea real? If not, why did so many people believe in it? And why do some still insist it was deliberately hidden? And this is where the story becomes disturbing, because what we uncover near the end changes how we understand this legend entirely. Grab a coffee or your favorite snack, and welcome to another episode of Deep Records. Let me tell you where this story actually begins. Not with ruins, not with maps, but with words. The earliest mentions of Hyperborea appear in the writings of ancient Greek authors, men who were trying quite seriously to understand the limits of their world. When Herodotus wrote his histories, he didn't claim certainty. He collected accounts, he compared stories. And when he reached the far north, he did something unusual. He admitted what he didn't know, yet spoke with conviction about what others believed. This is where things change. Hyperborea was described as a land beyond Boreas, the north wind itself, a place unreachable by ordinary travel. Peaceful, prosperous, untouched by hunger, war, or disease. Not a battlefield, not an empire, but a quiet perfection at the edge of the known world. Can you imagine that perspective? To the Greeks, this wasn't fantasy, it was geography under construction. Poets like Pindar echoed the same idea. Not as prophecy, but as cultural memory. Their descriptions weren't instructions, they were observations shaped by distance. And here's why that matters. These writers weren't inventing fairy tales, they were mapping ignorance. The question is not what they believed, but why a place like Hyperborea felt necessary at all. Because once you accept that, the next question becomes unavoidable. If the world had an edge, what else might have existed there? Before we can even ask whether Hyperborea existed, we need to slow down and understand how the ancient Greeks imagined the world itself. Because to them, geography was not just land and sea, it was certainty fading into uncertainty. Can you imagine living in a world where maps did not explain everything but ended abruptly? For the Greeks, the world was divided into three invisible zones. First, the known lands, places of trade, travel, and human experience. Then came the dangerous borders, regions of storms, extreme climates, and hostile nature. And beyond that, the mythical extremes, places no one could reach, but everyone talked about. This is where things change. The north, in particular, was not just another direction. It was cold, unreachable, poorly explored. Ancient travelers rarely returned with details, and when they did, their stories were fragmented, distorted by distance and fear. Here's why that matters. In Greek cosmology and early cartography, as studied by researchers like J.B. Harley, blank spaces on maps were never neutral. They were filled with meaning, with symbols, with imagination. Where maps ended, imagination began. Unknown regions slowly transformed into conceptual spaces, places where ordinary rules no longer applied. Not because the Greeks were naive, but because human beings have always tried to explain what lies just beyond certainty. Before you start questioning Hyperborea itself, remember this. In a world without satellites or polar expeditions, the idea of a perfect land beyond the known world didn't sound impossible. It sounded logical. And that logic is what carried Hyperborea forward, from a blank space on a map, into a place people genuinely believed could exist.
To understand Hyperborea, we first need to understand why did ancient people believe it could exist in the first place? From their perspective, this wasn't blind faith, it was logical. If you lived in the ancient world, your understanding of geography came from travelers, sailors, and fragmented reports. Some lands were fertile, others were brutal. Some regions burned under the sun, others froze beyond habitability. So let me ask you this. If extremes existed on one end of the world, why wouldn't the opposite extreme exist somewhere else? Ancient descriptions of Hyperborea are surprisingly consistent. Across different writers and time periods, the land is always placed far to the north. It is always associated with a mild, stable climate, and its people are always described as healthy, long-lived, and untouched by conflict. That kind of consistency matters. It suggests these stories weren't invented randomly, they were shaped by a shared framework of reasoning. Classical anthropologists point out something important here. Early societies often believed climate shaped human nature. Harsh environments produced struggle, balanced environments produced harmony. This wasn't fantasy, it was proto-science, early attempts to explain the world using cause and effect. So if deserts created hardship and mountains created isolation, then a perfectly balanced land might create a perfectly balanced society. Can you see how reasonable that sounds given the knowledge they had? But here's where doubt enters. No one describing Hyperborea had been there. Every account is second-hand, and while reasoning explains belief, it does not prove reality. Still, before you dismiss it, consider this. Many real places were once dismissed the same way. And that leads us to the next question. If people believed so strongly, has anyone ever tried to find it?
When modern scholars and explorers tried to translate ancient descriptions into geography, a pattern emerged. Every proposed location pointed north, far north, beyond familiar borders. Some placed Hyperborea near the Arctic Circle, where the sun behaves differently, rising and setting in ways that feel almost unreal. Others pointed towards Greenland, a landmass hidden under ice, vast enough to ignite speculation. A few researchers looked east, towards Siberia, arguing that its immense unexplored interior once hosted forgotten cultures. And then there was the most extreme proposal of all, the North Pole itself, a place with no land, only shifting ice. On paper, each location seemed possible. On the ground, everything fell silent. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, polar expeditions intensified. Officially, these missions were scientific, charting coastlines, studying ice, measuring climate. But behind the reports, some explorers admitted something else. They were searching for traces of earlier human presence. Anything that didn't belong. Archaeologists have identified Ice Age settlements in northern regions. That part is real. But no expedition uncovered cities, no tools that suggested a lost advanced society, no inscriptions, no structures buried beneath the ice. Every expedition returned with questions. Historical geography journals document the same conclusion again and again. Harsh environments preserve little, and what survives leaves no room for extraordinary claims. Arctic research archives are filled with measurements, maps, and ice cores, not evidence of Hyperborea. And this is where things become uncomfortable. Because if Hyperborea was real, it left nothing behind. No ruins, no artifacts, only a trail of failed searches stretching across frozen maps. So before you start to question whether something was hidden, we first have to ask a harder question. What happens when explorers search the ends of the earth and find only silence?
Let me tell you where this investigation becomes uncomfortable. Up to this point, Hyperborea sounds distant, elusive, but still possible. Now we slow down and we look for evidence. Because if Hyperborea was real, if it was inhabited, organized, advanced in any way, something should remain. And this is where things change. Archaeologists have explored the Arctic and subarctic regions for more than a century, not casually, systematically, with modern tools, satellite data, ice core analysis, and decades of fieldwork. And yet, no ruins, no cities, no tools, no inscriptions, no burial sites, nothing that clearly points to a forgotten civilization in the far north. You might hear claims about Ice Age artifacts, stone tools found in Siberia, bone carvings buried under frozen soil. But here's why that matters. Archaeologists have identified these objects as belonging to known hunter-gatherer cultures, small, mobile groups adapted to extreme cold. They show survival, not urban planning, not large populations, not advanced infrastructure. Some point to strange geological formations, unusual rock patterns, symmetrical shapes under ice. Shocked, right? But geologists explain these as natural processes: glacial pressure, freeze-thaw cycles, erosion over tens of thousands of years. Nature can imitate intention very convincingly. And here, the story begins to collapse. Because civilizations leave fingerprints, they leave layers, debris, patterns. Evidence doesn't disappear quietly. Entire cultures are not erased without trace, especially not in frozen environments where preservation is often exceptional. This absence doesn't prove Hyperborea never existed, but it severely limits what it could have been. At best, we are looking at myth layered onto fragments of Ice Age human presence. At worst, a story built entirely from imagination, filling a blank map. And before you start to question whether something was deliberately hidden, that takes us to the next chapter.
This is where things change. And this is where myth stopped being harmless. Until now, Hyperborea existed as an idea, distant, symbolic, and unprovable. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, some groups began to reshape that idea into something very different. Occult movements across Europe started to reinterpret Hyperborea not as a mythical land, but as the origin point of a superior ancient civilization. In their narratives, Hyperboreans were no longer symbolic figures. They became advanced beings, technologically gifted, intellectually dominant, and racially pure. Let me be clear here. This shift was not based on archaeology. It was not supported by anthropology, and it was not grounded in any scientific discovery. If I told you this reinterpretation later found its way into Nazi-era pseudoscience, that might not shock you, but the mechanism matters. According to historians like the occult roots of Nazism, these myths were selectively reshaped to justify racial ideology. Hyperborea became a fabricated ancestral homeland, used to give fictional history a sense of inevitability. Here's why that matters. When myths are treated as metaphors, they inspire imagination. When myths are treated as evidence, they become tools. Academic studies on pseudoscience consistently show the same pattern. Start with an unverifiable claim, remove the demand for proof, repeat it until it feels ancient, authoritative, and unquestionable. And before you start to question whether this still matters today, ask yourself this: what happens when an idea survives long enough to be reused, long after its original meaning is forgotten? That question leads us directly into the modern world.
At some point, every ancient mystery collides with the modern world, and this is where the story of Hyperborea takes a sharp turn. If you search for Hyperborea today, you won't find ancient maps first. You'll find theories, bold ones. One of the most repeated is the pole shift theory. The idea is simple. Earth's poles suddenly shifted in the distant past, triggering catastrophic climate changes. According to this theory, Hyperborea once sat in a temperate region until ice swallowed it overnight. The theory is compelling until examined. Paleoclimatology studies do confirm long-term climate shifts and ice ages, but no credible geological evidence supports a sudden global pole shift capable of erasing an advanced civilization within human history. These changes happen over tens of thousands of years, not generations. Then there's the idea of an advanced Ice Age civilization. Some researchers outside mainstream academia argue that humans during the Ice Age were far more sophisticated than we're told. They point to megalithic structures, astronomical alignments, and unexplained artifacts. Here's why that matters. Archaeologists have found complex hunter-gatherer societies.
But complexity is not the same as lost super technology. No cities, no infrastructure, no material record connects these findings to Hyperborea. And then comes the most seductive claim of all. They knew something we didn't. Can you imagine that? A hidden knowledge, a truth erased. Anthropologists studying conspiracy psychology explain why this idea spread so easily online. In uncertain times, hidden civilization narratives offer clarity, purpose, and a sense of belonging to those who see through the illusion. Before you start to question everything, pause, because here's the uncomfortable part. If Hyperborea had existed as described, traces would remain. Civilizations leave scars on the land, and this is where the mystery doesn't explode, it tightens, because the absence itself becomes the final question.
So, where does that leave us? After tracing ancient accounts, testing maps against reality, and weighing every fragment of evidence we actually have, one conclusion becomes impossible to ignore. There is no archaeological record of Hyperborea. No cities buried under ice, no tools, no inscriptions, no traces of a forgotten super-civilization. And if a society advanced enough to shape humanity had truly existed at the top of the world, some mark would remain. Evidence does not vanish completely. It erodes, it fragments, but it does not disappear without a trace. This is where things change. Because Hyperborea was never meant to be found on a map. It lived in the blank spaces, in the far north, where knowledge ended and imagination began. It offered an answer to a quiet human need, the idea that somewhere, once, there was a place untouched by suffering. So here is the final truth. Hyperborea is not a lost civilization. It's a mirror of human imagination, fear, and hope. And maybe that is why it still refuses to disappear.